interesting because I'm going to share very few numbers, and I'll come back at the very end and say why that is true. But the question I'm here to answer tonight is, how much do we value nature, and how can we answer that question? Consider this the tasting menu of methods in social science for how you might get around to that question. The first thing I'm going to just get everyone on the same page with is the many types of ecosystem services. This is a diagram adapted from the Millennium Assessment that was written in 2005. So getting old at this point, but sticking around. This is the most common way to identify ecosystem services. The most critical part of this diagram is the middle part. You'll see 4 words: provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural. Those are sort of the 4 broad categories of ecosystem services. And then the little high wedges around the outside are the way the Millennium Assessment breaks it up, breaks those categories down farther. As my introduction so politely pointed out, I'm a sociologist, so I will focus largely on cultural because that's the quadrant that I live in here tonight. But we do a lot of work across all 4. It just requires a team effort among hydrologists and biologists and chemists in some case to tackle those other ones. So there are methods associated with them. You might just not get the tasting menu for those. Yeah, I'll just move on from there. So the first one, jumping right on in. And I said tasting menu because I'll go through a variety of projects that we've done in each of the categories as an example. It's not the only way of doing it. It's just what I've personally worked on. So feel free to ask questions about the individual projects or the broad concepts. The example here is on mental and physical health. You might know of when you go to eat a raw oyster in an oyster bar, for instance, there's a small risk that you might come home with food poisoning. And the bacteria that causes that is Vibrio. Measuring health, of course, is a bit of a sticky wicket because there are so many aspects of health, and people vary in their baseline of healthy, and much, if not most, of health aspects go completely unreported, including food poisoning. However, and this is the kind of the take home of this, the relative costs across parts of the system are super helpful measures. So think of this oyster eating Vibrio scenario. Imagine that, think of the scenario in which you go out to eat, the infamous food poisoning bacteria is found in oysters or not. These are the different pathways you'll see here in the slide. So you have oysters for dinner. In some areas, it's either too cold or too salty for Vibrio to grow, and so food poisoning historically has not been an issue. Those are places like the Pacific Northwest. Here in Maryland, prevention measures are in place to protect consumers, such as harvesting only in the winter, or when the forecasts for Vibrio aren't saying it's a risk. And in the Gulf of Mexico, always cook your oysters. But as the climate warms, those latitudes of risk are moving northward, and we have to really wrestle with what that means. And that has an economic component to it. So we went to Washington State, where they're right on that border of, do we need to do prevention measures or not? And asked people how much they are spending to put engineering procedures into place to get those prevention measures in place for when they are too warm to just rely on nature. And the difference between doing nothing, which is what they have been historically doing, and what all of that equipment costs is considered the ecosystem value service. I do have numbers for this. So it was about 45 cents per dozen oysters harvested that they spent on a whole host of things. And I highlighted that in green here. The ecosystem health protection services that you're seeing by the cold and salty water in Puget Sound and the surrounding areas was once provided. In the future, it is projected to not be. So that was a really interesting place where you could measure because we're at this cusp of flipping between zones. And of course, everyone out there said, it's worth it because if you get sick, think of those costs. It's an order of magnitude higher. So you might as well spend the money on the extra fridges because you don't want to have to do recalls. My next example, this might seem like I'm ripping through very quickly, but the take-home message is the variety of methods that we take to do this, not the specifics of any individual study. The next ecosystem service is recreation and ecotourism. This is probably something you all have partaken in. We actually have, this is a really interesting area of research right now because there's no way to do it correctly. And so the answer is to do it multiple times using multiple methods and sort of triangulate on the right answer in terms of what are people doing in outdoor spaces and how much are they spending. What you're looking at here is a picture of the York River watershed in Southern Virginia. And we have 3 methods currently ongoing to measure recreation down there. One is human mobility data, that's what HMD stands for, based on cell phones. So if you have an app that has location services turned on your cell phone, third-party vendors will track that app and say, 15 people went to this spot at this time, and you can sort of track that over time. There were a lot of really interesting studies using this methodology over COVID that determined that outdoor recreation increased a lot in most places, if not all, around the country. So really hot topic these days. The more traditional way of measuring it is surveys where you place someone either at the beginning of a trailhead or mail out surveys to the surrounding area just to get a handle on who's visiting, or trail counters. So this is kind of like wildlife cameras. You can count people as they go past the entrance, for instance. Between the 3 of them, you kind of get a handle on what people are doing. Of course, the first way, you just get a raw count of people who have cell phones, which is not everyone, especially in using the river. Not everyone puts their cell phone in their pocket over salt water, which, comes with a risk. The survey methods also give you the opportunity to ask specifics about what are you doing? How much are you spending? Did you buy food while you were there? Did you buy equipment? Did you spend money at local restaurants? Those sorts of things. So that's really important if you're getting at those expenditure data rather than just how many people are using a raw spot. Both are valuable. It just depends on what you need. The next one is aesthetic. So this is just how pretty something is. This is most commonly done in a survey or interview setting. I ordered these cultural ecosystem services in what I like to call increasing degrees of squishiness, but more abstract concepts that don't really and probably shouldn't have dollar values associated to them. So we find more creative ways to quantify their value, but not necessarily putting monetary dollar values on it. And this is one of those examples. So this usually goes out in a survey. You'll see here on the left pictures of red cockaded woodpecker habitat in Florida. This is from one of my teammates' projects down in Florida, where they were asking people whether they preferred the red cockaded woodpecker habitat type kind of landscape or not, and how much would they be willing to pay to get the pretty trees. That was the end result. The pretty trees and the birds around them. On the right here, you see actually an AI visualization of what a wind turbine might look like in a coastal landscape. And they asked people, what do you think of this picture? What sort of values do you associate with this picture? And then they had the same picture without the AI wind turbine and ask the same questions, and you can sort of compare. And the key here, and this is going to be a recurring theme, is the comparison between the 2 scenarios. So it's not how much is this worth, it's how much is this one worth more than that one or less than that one. It shows a degree of impact, but it's really hard to get at exact values, but you can measure change or potential change in the case of the turbines. The final category in spiritual and religious values. This is an example survey question. So again, we measure this largely by survey or interviews. Is from the National Coral Reef Monitoring Program, which measures how well the reefs are doing to provide necessary ecosystem services to nearby communities, among a whole host of other things, including the health of the coral. The past 2 surveys deployed in Puerto Rico and Guam added a question specifically about spiritual and religious values, since they got a lot of feedback from people writing in the bottom of their surveys, hey, we have these values, you haven't been asking about it, I don't know how to categorize it. And since the questions have been added, there are in the 70 to 80% range of people claiming that the reefs are important to a whole host, all of these cultural practices. And yeah, like I said, this is best measured in a survey or in a qualitative, rich kind of data collection metric. I will say this is going out to other coral jurisdictions. So we'll have, again, a degree of comparison between Florida, Texas, Puerto Rico, Guam, Hawaii, to see, is it the same everywhere in very different cultural contexts? What are we really focusing in on with the corals? Let's see, next. All right, moving on, we're gonna jump up to the category level, starting with provisioning, just A, to keep things short, and B, because we've now left my primary expertise. But provisioning is probably what most of you are familiar with. It's a fancy way for saying using stuff directly, eating it, or making a job out of it. The primary example from NOAA is, of course, fisheries. That is one of our legislative mandates. And this is a report card from the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council, or provided to the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council, that tracks over time the ecosystem services provided by the commercial fishery through annual reports. There are, of course, aspects of this that are harder to track, like subsistence fishing or home gardens. But the commercial fishery is the vast majority of the provisioning services provided by said fish. So it's a pretty good estimate, especially if you're tracking difference over time of what's going on. Yeah, I will stop there. There's a lot here. So this is provision. This is what the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council has chosen to keep track of, but commercial and recreational are both on there. Interactions with protected species and social and cultural uses, again, really hard to quantify. So that's why it says a status only indicator. But these are the kind of things that NOAA is concerned about and tracking over time. And these are yearly indicators. So this is a level of data that you haven't yet seen in my tasting menu of examples. The next one is regulating, next broad category, I should say. What you see here is a picture of New Jersey. And this is a bit like the Vibrio example. This is a damages avoided study. So they modeled hydrodynamics of these marshes that you're looking at to figure out how much it would cost to engineer the exact same services using riprap and geoengineered sort of human services versus just leaving the marsh in place. And so there are actual numbers here. This is finished a long time ago. Modeled with the marsh absent, with the marsh present, to determine the value of the marsh. I will say, we focused on Sandy, so there's a bit of a natural experiment there too of were the houses protected before Sandy or after Sandy, and which ones received some financial benefits. This is also not just theoretical here in Maryland, well, around the whole country, but it is experienced primarily by your average human as a discount on flood insurance if certain environmental protection measures are in place to ensure the functioning of the regulating services in the form of the community rating system. So your county will keep track of all of the services, flood prevention services that are provided or protected in your county, and provide you points on your flood insurance, and you might have to pay a significant amount less as a result of those services. So this is a number that people personally wrestle with themselves. All right, next step up in the world of ecosystem services is asking about them all at once. I'll have a few examples of this, just the collective. Most people don't necessarily know what an ecosystem service is. They have a really hard time sort of teasing apart the many streams of ecosystem services that might be coming in, especially if you ask them in the form of a 5 or 10-minute survey. So another way of doing that is to focus on the ecosystem and then sort of tease out a bundle of ecosystem services that are provided. And that's what you see here. This is the Choptank watershed, which is where I am currently located. You'll see just land cover on the left-hand side. So those are the ecosystems that are providing the services. And then on the right-hand side, these are benefits to property values, the darker green, the more benefits, determined through a metric called hedonic valuation. And you might have encountered this by, if you've ever tried to sell a house, they set the price of that house based on finding similar houses that have sold in your area and how much they sold for. This goes a little bit further than that by not only taking the aspects of the house into account, so not just how many bedrooms and bathrooms and square footage and all that kind of good stuff, but what is surrounding it. Like, is it near a beautiful view of the bay, or does it have old growth forest included in the property, or does it have agricultural potential, those sorts of things, and bundles that together in a fairly complicated statistical methodology, but you can tease out sort of the bump in value from green space and from the ecosystem services provided. And in certain areas, it's especially on the Eastern Shore, that is a large portion of the property value itself. I use the term viewshed. That's a bit of a wonky jargon term, but it's basically what you can see from the property. Like if you look around, if something is really high up, you'll be able to see further. Another way I've seen people do it is a half-a-mile walking distance. That's considered sort of your average daily walking commute. Like if you have a dog or something, that's what you might encounter. in your neighborhood, and that is more commonly used in urban settings. So for those of you in the big cities, that's probably how you'll see it, not the view shed, but that's what we did view shed here. Where am I? Another collective one, participatory mapping. It's very similar, but instead of providing a map with stuff on it, you're asking people, usually in a workshop format, although I've seen it done in surveys. Maps take a really long time to sort of interpret and get to the point, I guess. Anyway, it can be done either in a workshop format, in a group setting, like a focus group, or in a survey. You give people a map with some landmarks on it and you say, put a dot where you value. And then the follow-up question is, what do you value about that space? And so what you see here is a project we did off the coast of Georgia, and the pink outlines are protected areas. So we were specifically interested in what people value in those protected areas, but you can see dots peppering the map for all sorts of reasons. Some of those are directly related to the protected areas. Some of them aren't, but people don't really differentiate. So you ask in this bundle fashion, why do you value these areas? And then you get total scores of what people valued and why. And you can do some fun statistics on that. It's a spatial approach. So this is really, if you want to know what's doing where, it's very commonly used in marine spatial planning efforts. So think if you have to put a new ocean use in Georgia, they were planning on expanding the port, so additional large shipping traffic, or offshore wind or new aquaculture zones. You want to try to put that where people don't have a lot of other activities going on. So this sort of exercise is very helpful for that. The next one, and I admit this is a hairball. You can then model those ecosystem services, including the cultural values, which often don't have numbers attached, as part of broader ecosystem models. These models are built by asking key informants, usually, or subject matter experts, what ecosystem services are important to them for the study topic or region and how they're connected to each other. And that connection point is the really important part. This hairball, my least favorite, but also favorite figure, is an example that we made at the 2016 Oyster Summit for the Chesapeake, where we asked people to name the most important factors affecting the oyster population in the bay. Some of them are ecosystem services and some aren't. We had a mix. But then you can use the model to predict the effect of proposed policy changes. So some of the policy changes were, what if we ratchet down fishing and they're not allowed to fish as much, for example? What else will that have? What other effects will that have through the system? So you can model changes that way. And this is one of my favorite studies because we actually found a lot of win-win potential in areas where the stakeholders who took the survey told us that they sometimes butt heads. But when at the end of the day, they all wanted more oysters and they wanted increased ecosystem service areas. So it was a chance to identify win-wins, maybe by counting a few concepts that aren't at the top of mind in other areas. I will start to wrap up with, okay, that was the tasting menu. How do we pick which one we actually use? And this is where logistics comes to maybe bite you sometimes. What I gave you was just a catalog of buying samples. There are other ways of doing it or other flavors of what I presented, depending on your context. Obviously, methods will change a little bit. It's far from a complete compendium, but I think this helps you kind of stretch out. I gave you examples sort of across the diversity of approaches. So this hopefully will help you pick. The first question is, how abstract is your ecosystem services? So is it something that it's easy to get numbers around? For example, is there a formal market? Is it a little bit more abstract, like the spiritual religious values? It's harder to really get your head around in a quantitative way. If it's super abstract, you have to talk to people. You need that rich qualitative data that comes in with surveys or really interviews to help make sense of any numbers you can extract out of them. If it's a little more quantifiable to begin with, then the next question is there a formal market for it? If it's been commodified in any way, shape, or form, it opens up a whole host of economic techniques, like the housing values that we talked about, or like the oyster industry example, where there are real actual dollars spent that you can track and compare scenarios to. If there aren't those formal markets, then the next question are, what are your resources? If you only have a little bit of money to work with, then the question becomes, what can you do in the interim. Basically, are there proxies for the service that you're interested in? So instead of looking at housing values, you might look at the number of houses sold. You know, a slight twist on the concept, but it generally addresses the same thing. If there aren't any proxies, or you have a lot of money and resources to do something fun, that gets back to your primary data collection. So now we're back to talking about surveys or interviews. And I say resources because it's not always dollars. Sometimes it's boots on the ground, and those can cost dollars, but it could be a partnership with students who help you get the work done, that sort of thing. So sometimes we're expensive and sometimes we're not, depending on the context. And I'll end with my caveat, I guess, the fine print. That's hopefully not so fine, but I'll leave you with some questions to really think about quantifying ecosystem services, trying to measure them. Is it an appropriate approach for your research question? The first is, who is receiving these ecosystem services? That helps determine the scale of your study. The classic example that I learned back in college was people around the world care if polar bears exist, even if they never get to see one. It's a climate connected thing, so that's why. But it wouldn't do you much good to just go survey the folks in Churchill, Canada, where most polar bears exist. That's the town with the most polar bears on the whole planet. You'd have to somehow incorporate this existence value in the rest of the world, be that through people who visit zoos or attached to educational programs about climate or Arctic animals, to really get the full picture. The next set of questions, and many more like them, this is just the ones I'd like to leave you with, are a reminder that these are human values that we're talking about, and sometimes, often, those are very personal and should be treated with a lot of care. This is especially true if you ask someone to put a dot on a map, and even more especially true if you ask someone to attach a dollar value to it. So that gets to my first question here. Is it ethical to quantify these ecosystem services? Or is it better to describe them in a rich, more anthropological sort of context, document them in a different way? Related to that is, am I expressing these results in a culturally sensitive manner? This comes up with the money thing a lot. By attaching a dollar value to it, it tips things more toward the commodification end of the scale. And so you have to be careful if you're putting a dollar value on it. Do people want those things seen as a commodity? Or is this something truly intangible, maybe quantifiable, but intangible, that they don't want in a formal market? And then finally, this is a little more data scientific wonky, but very important, is how much uncertainty is included in your measurement and how are you communicating that? So think back to the icebreaker. I love that example. They gave a nice, round, beautiful number of $58 trillion for the whole world for freshwater ecosystems. I am certain we don't even know how much freshwater there is in the entire world and what that's projected to be like in the next 100 years, 1,000 years, how people use that freshwater, how close that freshwater is to them. Values tend to disappear the further they are from your realm of existence. So I'm certain it's $58 trillion plus or minus 10, $20 trillion. I'm absolutely guessing at that number, but often it gets left out. And so not only does it get left out, but often it is the same. It'll be $58 trillion plus or minus $50 trillion. So what does that mean? Is the range perhaps more important? Or are we honing in on something, but it's still a work in progress? So just food for thought about how these numbers get communicated, because people hear a number and they love it and they run with it, and policymakers absolutely adore dollar values. And there are fabulous reasons for them to kind of roll with that, but you have to be really careful when you start a project like this that you're not going to give them a dollar value that kind of gets out of your control in their storytelling. And with that, I will end with a slide with our entire team. Some of the projects I mentioned are largely from them and our ex-team members who have moved on to more bigger jobs in other places. And to tease our team, this is about a third of what our team does. The other studies overlap a little bit, are human use mapping and climate change vulnerability. So if you see me again around Baltimore, especially, our ongoing research in Maryland right now is that community climate vulnerability work. focused on the Baltimore commuter shed, another fun word about people's realm of existence. So just wanted to give you that broader context in case you encounter me in that context as well. And I hope I left plenty of time for questions. So I will stop sharing and open it up to you all. And check.
Thank you so much. And I can put how do we value that presentation? It's priceless. So that was easy. Thank you so much. Let me put a spotlight on you. Okay, we've spotlighted you, and we'll open it up for questions. You can put your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand, and I will call on you, and you can ask a question directly to Dr. Freitag. And I have a question. I'll start off. I know that you ended with me saying, "Oh, everybody likes a little number," and and I fell right into that trap and brought everybody with me. But let me ask you this: what other metrics then are used and instead of dollars in your studies, and to quantify? I mean, even have to quantify the unquantifiable, I guess, or the more abstract kind of responses that you do get.
Yeah, that's a good question. People jump to dollars, but I'll start with there are a lot of ways to quantify things that aren't dollars. And yes, Gary Allen just said Maryland has an ecosystem evaluation team in the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. Elliot Campbell just gave a lovely talk today at one of the Chesapeake Bay program meetings about that. And actually, I stole some notes from him and inserted this here in some of my caveats about how you use his data. So I hope that we are on the same page. But he addressed this question, so I'll address those comments both together. There are ways of quantifying it, like think of per capita service provision. So the number of opportunities to go recreational fishing, instead of trying to say recreational fishing is worth $100 billion in the Chesapeake, you might say 50% of people in the Chesapeake go recreational fishing. And that's quantified, but doesn't have a dollar value, and counts all those people who like stick a chicken neck out their backyard as opposed to go spend a bunch of money, whereas the dollar value doesn't capture them. So it really gets to what is the point of your study, I guess, and why are you doing it that way? The other way of quantifying it, but that can also bring in qualitative data, is the spatial approaches. So you can say, 2,000 people pinned this point as a really spiritual place. And this is happening out in Oregon, where they're trying to put in wind turbines. They had done a bunch of deconflicting studies, trying to figure out who was using where in the ocean ahead of time, but didn't think, well, I am not going to read into BOEM, but didn't ask about spiritual values. And it turns out that was the value of concern out there. And so now they're going back and saying, okay, draw me a map. Where are these spiritual values held, and how can we further hone our maps to make sure that we're not putting wind turbines in your spiritual place? And you can think of things like people do their maps differently, number of dots in a place, or percent cover. If it's a certain type of habitat, how much of the habitat is taken up by a particular use, that sort of thing. That gets a little more specific, but that works. I see. Gary, can such evaluations be summarized as a quality of life index apart from dollars? This is a fascinating question. In other places, they use the Human Development Index or happiness index. That is not a United States thing. I don't know why, and I have a whole lot of theories, but it doesn't have the same kind of play here in the academic or policy community to do it that way. I've also heard of well-being indexes here. I've actually calculated one for the Gulf of Mexico that carries a little more weight, and that is a way of combining both dollars and squishier data, qualitative and quantitative, generally spatial. So you're looking at an area and what sort of values does it have in it. Yeah, and then I would be remiss if I didn't go back to my statement at the beginning. The percent change over time, or the predicted change under a certain policy. is another really good way of quantifying it. However you did choose to quantify it, dollars or otherwise, you could say 10% more people are going to have access to this in the future or less, something for that example.
All right, Richard, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, and this is so excellent. My career was in engineering. I love to calculate and model things. But in your case, I'm so impressed about, if you think about it enough, you can put a number on a lot of things that gives you insight as to what might be happening or how to track it. NOAA, my understanding, is a federal agency, probably, is it not? All of this good stuff that you have and insight into all of these things, who can use this? Do you give it to other agencies? Do you give it to industry? Do you give it to other countries? Do you just wait for people to log on and download stuff? Can you say something about how this all gets used?
Yeah, actually. So our team, each project has a distinct client. I think that's what you're asking. And that ranges depending on the project. So sometimes it'll be a local planning commission, like the New Hampshire and New Jersey studies, where oftentimes it's other parts of NOAA that have legal jurisdictions over things like fisheries. I work a lot with fisheries. Other folks work with weather service, depending on what sorts of ecosystems you are concerned about. We've been working really closely with BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, recently because they're trying to figure out where to put wind turbines and how to do that with the least possible impact. So they need a load of information of all different sorts. And they're utilizing us to help get a handle on human impacts. And then NOAA as a whole has an annual congressional briefing. I will say, as a relatively low-lying wonk within NOAA, it's rare that my stuff gets thrown in front of Congress, but if you have a heavy-hitting, you come up with something really big in the science community, it will make it directly to Congress because, like you said, we are an agency. But yeah, it's tailored to the project, and we try to decide who that user will be before even asking for money or permission to do the project, because you can't do something if no one's going to use it.
Okay, good. So there's a lot of goal-oriented stuff going on there. That's excellent. Thank you, ma'am.
Jean asks, how many participants are included in the surveys, both by groups and personal interviews?
Yeah, that's a good question. It varies a lot and depends a lot on how much money you have. I will say the post office just raised their stamp price to 65 cents or 60 something cents. So it sounds tiny, but like we're talking the York River watershed, I think we're targeting around 5,000 households, and that's actually the small side because only about 20% of people are going to answer that survey. So you overshoot, and the number, based on the number you hope to get back in the mail. And not only that, it's 20% at the end of 5 reminders, is we generally send them a postcard, hey, this is coming. Then we send them a letter saying, hey, this is online, please go check it out, take it. If you didn't take it at that point, you get a whole big survey in the mail in paper, please take it, mail it back. So a lot of stamps. That was a bit in the rabbit hole, but yeah, in the 2,000 to 10,000 range for surveys, for mail surveys usually, unless it's a very defined small area, or interviews, in which case then you're talking maybe hundreds. In the Chop Tank watershed, we did some ground truthing work on the south end in Cambridge over there, and there was a distinct neighborhood that we wanted to sort of make sure what we were saying made sense. It was about 100 houses, and we had a student go door to door to get their perspective. So a lot less, but you get a much more rich discussion. So each person then is an hour roughly of interview time. There will be snacks involved in person. So very different dynamic. And often you try to do both. But the important part is that 20% response rate if you're mail-in surveys, and you get closer to 75% if you go door to door. But it's a conversation, and it's not, please take this thing for 10 minutes. It's a longer approach.
are you collecting demographic information along with that? I mean, are you worried that the information that you're getting is skewed in one way or another demographically, or for the people who would send back a survey versus those that don't, so you're not getting a full picture?
Yeah, Phyllis, I did say 75% when you go door to door, multiple times, I should say. Yes, there is bias. I will just flat out say that. Old, white, retired people love to fill out surveys and mail them back. And they will be overrepresented in your sample, kind of no matter where you are or what you ask about. It's amazing. I love them for their enthusiasm, but sometimes it doesn't match the rest of the community. So oftentimes you have to reach out specially to everyone else, the younger set, anyone who's not white, anyone who doesn't speak English, to try to get them specifically. We also stratify by geography. So that's related to demographics, obviously, but you can hit certain areas to try to get the numbers up from the demographics that you think you need to target. And then there's a weighting. At the end of the day, you're probably not going to get a representative sample in some way, shape, or form, but we do have census data and they are not perfect. I should say that, but they're as close to perfect as you're going to get in terms of account of people. And so that's, you can compare your sample to what census says who lives there and figure out in what ways you're wrong, and then weight the samples appropriately. So if you didn't have as many African-American folks taking your survey, you can multiply all of their answers, for example, by 1.2 to get your final percentages to kind of even it out a little bit. But that only goes so far. So you got to try in the recruitment phase to get as many people to kind of match the demography as you can.
All right, John asks, there are a lot of relationships to be analyzed. How do you verify or test the model?
It depends on which one. So the most active, I guess, robust way of doing it is what we were doing in Virginia with the 3 different methods. And at the end of the day, do they tell the same story? That's obviously expensive and not possible to do everywhere, or in some cases you can't do multiple methods. So it is what it is. In other ways, sometimes time will play out. If you're trying to model a scenario, then the scenario happens, like Sandy hits Jersey, for instance. We then got to go back in and say, natural experiment, did what we think was going to happen. And in many, but not all cases of the little neighborhoods we looked at in Jersey, it did happen. And then we got to ask why, what in the areas that it didn't match up, what was going on, and is there a mathematical way to fix it? Or is that just part of that wild uncertainty that I mentioned at the very end that's included in models? Models are not right, but are they helpful is the question. So that's the question we ask is it useful? Is it right enough?
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? I'm going to throw in the one that we always have to ask is, now that you've done all of these valuations and permutations and everything like that, how is climate change impacting those results, or are they?
Yeah, they're definitely affecting the where. So people are used to deriving their ecosystem services of all sorts. And the best example is fishing. If you eat flounder, it comes from a range that it lives in, and flounders are moving north. So they've actually reallocated where the fishermen can catch them to the northern states. Same with blue crab. They flew some watermen up there, up to Maine, to teach the lobstermen how to catch blue crab, because lobsters are going down, blue crabs are going up. So it depends on at what level you're measuring. If it's just fisheries value, that all gets lumped together, right? If you start talking what type of fish, then it has a huge impact. And that's where a lot of our work is headed, is people do care what type of fish, and it's very connected to culture. I shouldn't have to say that in Maryland. It's part of our, crabs are part of our being. So then the question is, will there be a substitute? Do the models of these range shifts kind of cover the cultural needs? as opposed to just providing the fish. But it kind of permeates everything, honestly. The world is changing very quickly, both in terms of climate and people's reaction to it. And the most direct example was the Vibrio one, right? Where you used to not have to do anything to worry about food poisoning in Washington state. And then they had 2 years of a lot of people getting sick. And now they have to buy fancy equipment to keep all of their oysters cold. So that was a real impact, that they did have an ecosystem service and now it's not there.
And then I was a little bit confused about the clients, because as a government organization, I would think that we, the people, are the clients where the data is supposed to be going to. And then if you are, clients, I just, sometimes do the entities like New Jersey City want a specific outcome through this data so that they can then go back and get the money or say that this is going to what we were going to do. So is there some kind of, the end is you're trying to get to a specific point and trying to sell something.
Yeah, some of the cities we work with might want that, but that might not be what they get. Like they may and have been unpleasantly surprised sometimes, especially with economic valuation. Actually, we were asked by Smith Island, or a group down at Smith Island, to do some ecosystem service valuations about moving the dredged channels to get in and out of the working waterfront there. And our response was, I don't think you want me to do that because you think it's going to be big dollar values. And I can tell that you think that. And I don't think you're going to get it. And I don't think it'll be helpful to the mission of increasing resilience in Smith Island. So that sort of thing. But getting back to your larger question of clients, this is sort of like writing for the general public. Authors often say, there is no such thing as the general public. So who do you really mean? And so that's what I mean by clients. And this is often why there are other agencies with extension branches within them. NOAA does have some, but some direct interaction with the public at large and deciding exactly what that means. But it's often who comes to us with a need, and that is other government entities largely. And where we think we can do the most help based on some national models. And I will say Weather Service is different. So they do a lot of modeling to get that lovely forecast in your phone that goes directly to you. But Ocean Service is a little more nebulous. And we do have our ultimate clients are coastal county residents, essentially, the coastal zone area. Not that Colorado doesn't matter to us, but it's not one of our direct constituents, I guess. But we tend to go through others to get to those people just because not everyone reads everything, if you will.
And I should have asked that question a little bit more delicate.
No, it's a good one.
Well, you answered it well, because I should have asked, are there any data that comes back in the evaluations that the client does not expect? And
yeah, actually, this is why I cautioned against economic studies in general. They generally come back lower than people expect because those methods tend to undervalue things that can't be monetized. It's a known thing in economics, but if you didn't take economics in college or whatever, then you wouldn't know that. So it's a very common conversation that we have.
Right. Any other questions? What are you working on right now? Is there anything right now other in the valuation sector that you're working on?
Well, I mentioned the climate vulnerability study in Baltimore. There will be a valuation chunk of that and some forecasting involved. We've gotten a lot of feedback that not just us, but people tend to model climate out to 2100, but not the people. So even just where the people will be, let alone what those folks want in where they live and what they do. And so we're trying to forecast this kind of stuff out as far as the climate models will take us, just so we have matching data so we can compare apples to apples.
Well, that sounds fascinating. It's like you're looking in trying to look in the ball there, crystal ball, and see what's going to be, see the future.
We shall see.
All right, any other questions for Dr. Freitag this evening? All right, everybody seems smarter than they were when they started out this tonight, so it's been a success. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us this evening, and thank you for all that you're doing to help us better understand our world and our place in it, and how we can interact with nature in a better way. Everyone, stay well, stay safe, stay outside, and we'll see you next week where we're going to space, going back to James Webb. So we'll see you then. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.